When Hans Fischer found himself with his hands raised above his head on French soil in June of 1944, just days after the Allied invasion had torn through the coastline near Caen, he had every reason to believe his life was about to end in the worst possible way. The stories circulated among Wehrmacht soldiers about what happened to prisoners in American hands, the propaganda that had been drilled into their minds for years, all of it pointed toward brutality, toward revenge, toward the kind of treatment that victors supposedly inflicted upon the vanquished. What Fischer could not have anticipated, what no amount of Reich education could have prepared him for, was that his capture would become the beginning of an education in a completely different kind of warfare, one that would fundamentally alter his understanding of power, prosperity, and what it meant to lose to a nation like America. The journey that followed Fischer's surrender began with confusion. Instead of being herded into makeshift camps or facing immediate interrogation under harsh conditions, he found himself treated with a peculiar kind of efficiency that seemed almost bureaucratic in its orderliness. There were no beatings, no deprivation designed to break his spirit, just processing, documentation, and eventually transportation. When Fischer and thousands of men like him were loaded onto ships bound for the United States, the first shock came not from violence, but from its absence. The vessels that carried them across the Atlantic weren't prison ships in any traditional sense. Men who had fought in North Africa with Rommel's forces couldn't believe what they were experiencing. They wrote letters home describing the voyage in terms that sounded absurd, talking about being fed white bread at every single meal, about meat appearing on their plates twice each day, about treatment that seemed more appropriate for passengers than for enemy combatants. The confusion only intensified when Fischer stepped off the train in Texas 3 weeks after his capture. The heat was oppressive, typical for that region in summer, with temperatures climbing past 98 degrees. But the weather wasn't what stopped Fischer in his tracks and made him question everything he thought he understood. It was the lights. Everywhere he looked, electric lights blazed away in the middle of the day, burning in buildings that appeared to be empty, consuming power that could have electrified entire villages back in Germany, wasted with a casualness that suggested an almost incomprehensible abundance. This wasn't just wealth. This was wealth so excessive that it could afford to be careless. And for a soldier from a nation that had been counting every resource, every watt of electricity, every scrap of metal for years, the display was almost offensive in its extravagance. The scale of what was happening with German prisoners on American soil was staggering in ways that went far beyond individual experiences. By the time the war reached its conclusion in 1945, nearly 400,000 German prisoners of war were living in camps scattered across the continental United States. These men weren't simply being held, they were being put to work in ways that would generate enormous economic value for their captors. In the cotton fields of Mississippi, in the wheat fields of Kansas, in the sugarcane plantations of Louisiana, German soldiers who had once fought to expand the Third Reich now found themselves participating in American agriculture. The economic calculations were brutal in their clarity. The prisoner labor program would save the American economy $230 million, a figure that translates to roughly $3.8 billion in contemporary currency. But the numbers, as impressive as they were, don't capture the real story of what happened when soldiers from a collapsing totalitarian state were given an extended, intimate view of how American capitalism actually functioned. On August 15th of 1943, when the Liberty ship Thomas Victory arrived at Norfolk Naval Base in Virginia, carrying 1,847 German prisoners captured during the North African campaign, a man named Feldwebel Miller expected to be subjected to propaganda. He assumed the Americans would parade the prisoners past carefully staged displays of abundance, the kind of Potemkin villages that Stalin had supposedly constructed to fool foreign observers, temporary facades designed to mask deeper scarcity. What Miller saw instead was something he couldn't dismiss as theatrical deception because it was too mundane, too casual, too obviously functional. The parking lot near the naval base contained hundreds of automobiles, and these weren't military vehicles or trucks belonging to officers. These were personal cars, civilian vehicles, the kind of transportation that ordinary workers drove to their jobs. In Germany, Miller's commanding officer, a colonel, hadn't owned a car. Here in America, dock workers apparently drove to work every day in their own vehicles. The train journey from Virginia to Texas took 3 full days, and during that time Miller started counting grain elevators. He gave up when he reached 300. Each one of those enormous structures held more wheat than his entire province in Germany had produced the previous year. The guards who accompanied the prisoners on the train ate chocolate bars, real chocolate, and when they were finished they simply threw away the wrappers. German children dreamed about chocolate, fantasized about the taste of something that had become almost impossible to obtain, while American soldiers consumed it casually and discarded the packaging without a second thought. Miller began writing letters to his wife, and in those letters he documented things that must have seemed almost impossible to believe from the perspective of wartime Germany. The Americans were feeding their prisoners the same rations that American troops received, he wrote, 2,800 calories every single day. The Geneva Convention only required 2,000 calories for prisoners of war. Miller gained 12 pounds during his first month in American captivity. The camps themselves represented a complete contradiction of what these men expected from imprisonment. 511 main camps were established, along with thousands of smaller branch facilities, creating a network that stretched from Aliceville in Alabama all the way to Worland in Wyoming. These weren't primitive detention facilities designed to break men down through deprivation. They were built to American standards, which meant hot showers, flush toilets, electric lighting, even movie theaters in some locations. At the camp in Concordia, Kansas, the prisoners were allowed to build a soccer stadium. They organized orchestra concerts. They published newspapers. The American commanders approved all of these activities, following directives from Washington that emphasized keeping the prisoners busy and productive. The philosophy was simple and utterly pragmatic. Keep them working, and work they did in ways that would prove crucial to the American war effort in unexpected ways. By September of 1944, the United States was facing a severe labor crisis. 11 million Americans were fighting overseas. Another 15 million had been absorbed into factories building weapons and military equipment. The fundamental question facing the agricultural sector was stark. Who would harvest the crops? Who would pick the cotton? Who would ensure that America could feed itself and its allies while simultaneously prosecuting a global war? The answer, bizarrely enough, turned out to be the prisoners of war themselves. The War Department approached this situation with cold calculation. Each prisoner cost approximately 60 cents per day to feed and maintain. Those same prisoners could generate between $5 and $8 worth of agricultural labor every single day. The profit margin exceeded 1,000%. By the spring of 1945, German prisoners of war were providing 10% of all agricultural labor in the United States. They picked 80 million pounds of cotton. They saved 160,000 acres of sugar beets from being lost to lack of workers. They harvested enough wheat to bake 18 billion loaves of bread. At Camp McLean in Texas, the prisoners were given permission to purchase musical instruments. They formed a 40-piece orchestra that performed Beethoven on Sunday afternoons. A man named Klaus Becker, originally from Hamburg, found himself telling his bunkmate something that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. They were eating better as prisoners than German civilians were eating at home. They were eating better than they had eaten as soldiers in the Wehrmacht. The truth of Becker's observation was undeniable. The average German prisoner of war in American custody gained 15 pounds during his captivity. They received the same rations as American troops, which meant 5,300 calories on days when they performed physical labor. They had access to fresh milk, real eggs, white bread that contained actual wheat flour instead of the sawdust extended substitutes that had become common in Germany. On Christmas Eve of 1944, at Camp Robinson in Arkansas, the mess hall served turkey with cranberry sauce, mashed potatoes swimming in butter, green beans, apple pie, coffee with unlimited sugar. An Unteroffizier named Wilhelm Schmidt sat staring at his plate, thinking about his family in Berlin surviving on 1,500 calories per day, assuming they survived the bombing raids at all, assuming the Soviet advance hadn't already overrun their neighborhood. Schmidt was eating Christmas dinner in enemy territory, and it was the best meal he had consumed in his entire life. The local Baptist church sent cookies to the camp, actual butter cookies made with real ingredients. Lutheran ladies from nearby towns brought hand-knitted socks. The German prisoners sang Silent Night in their native language, and the American guards sang the same hymn back to them in English. Schmidt recorded his thoughts in a diary, writing that the Americans were insane, that they fed their enemies better than Germany had fed its allies. The economic story that emerged from this massive prisoner labor program is genuinely staggering when examined in detail. In 1944 alone, prisoner of war labor saved American farmers $22 million, equivalent to approximately $370 million in current dollars. The prisoners worked a combined total of 46 million man-days. They processed 1.2 billion pounds of food. They constructed 15,000 miles of terraced farmland for erosion control. But what the prisoners were observing went far beyond the immediate economics of agricultural labor. At Camp Cook in California, German soldiers watched the workers streaming in and out of the nearby Lockheed plant in 3 shifts that ran around the clock. P-38. Lightning fighters rolled off the assembly line every 45 minutes. The parking lot outside the factory held 8,000 cars, and many of those vehicles belonged to women who were building advanced warplanes and earning more money in a single month than German workers typically saw in an entire year. A former Luftwaffe mechanic named Erich Hartmann started doing calculations in his head. America had built 96,000 aircraft in 1944. Germany had managed 40,000. And the Americans were accomplishing this industrial miracle using women and prisoners to free up their men for combat roles. Hartmann was correct about the production numbers, but wrong about one crucial detail. Prisoners couldn't work in defense plants, couldn't be employed in any facility that directly contributed to weapons manufacturing. But they could pick the cotton, harvest the wheat, process the food that fed the workers who did build bombers and fighters. Every German prisoner working in an agricultural role meant another American was available to work in a factory or serve in the military. It was economic warfare in its purest, most efficient form. The Willow Run plant in Michigan exemplified the sheer scale of American industrial capacity. That single facility produced one B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes, 650 per month. The plant covered 5 million square feet, had its own airport, its own power generation, an assembly line that stretched for a full mile. Meanwhile, in camps throughout Michigan and neighboring states, German prisoners harvested the crops that fed Willow Run's 42,000 workers. They were literally sustaining the machine that was destroying their homeland, and they were being paid American wages to do it. In March of 1945, at Camp Blanding in Florida, news arrived that the Allies had crossed the Rhine. Germany was collapsing. The prisoners gathered around radios and listened to their world coming apart, to cities falling, to the Reich disintegrating. And something remarkable happened in the aftermath of that news. The Americans didn't gloat. They didn't cut rations or impose harsher conditions. The food kept arriving in the same quantities. The work schedule continued unchanged. The 80 cents per day that each prisoner earned never stopped flowing. An Obergefreiter named Johann Weber from Munich had been assigned to work in a local canning plant where he processed 10,000 cans of orange juice every single day. The plant owner, a man named Mr. Davidson, worked alongside his German prisoners, called Weber by the nickname Johnny, brought him coffee in the mornings. Weber finally asked the question that had been troubling him. Why? Why treat enemy soldiers with this kind of basic human decency? Davidson's answer was simple and utterly American in its directness. Weber was helping him make money. Davidson was helping America win the war. Everybody won except Hitler. The numbers supported Davidson's blunt assessment of the situation. Prisoner of war labor in 1945 generated $100 million in agricultural value for the American economy. It saved 350,000 tons of vegetables from rotting in fields for lack of workers to harvest them. The prisoners helped bring in enough grain to feed 3 million people for an entire year. The Pentagon calculated that each individual prisoner effectively replaced 1.3 American agricultural workers. That's 520,000 Americans freed from farm work, available instead for military service or defense industry employment. 520,000 people. That represented the equivalent of 3 entire armies, all made available because German prisoners were picking cotton and harvesting wheat. But the economic impact, as significant as it was, wasn't the most powerful weapon that America deployed through this program. The real weapon was psychological, was the demonstration effect of showing German soldiers what American capitalism could actually accomplish. On May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day, the prisoners at Camp Shelby in Mississippi watched newsreels showing Berlin in ruins, Hitler dead, German cities reduced to rubble by years of bombing. Then those same men walked back to their barracks, buildings with electricity, running water, full pantries, conditions that were superior to what most German civilians were experiencing. A Gefreiter named Franz Müller wrote home to his family with an observation that captured something essential. Germany had lost to a nation that fed its enemies ice cream, that provided prisoners with dental care, that paid them wages to pick cotton. Looking at the disparity in resources, in industrial capacity, in sheer abundance, Müller concluded that Germany had never had a realistic chance of winning. The formal re-education program for German prisoners didn't officially begin until the summer of 1945, but in a very real sense the education had started the moment these men laid eyes on those parking lots full of civilian cars, those endless electric lights burning wastefully, those mountains of food that seemed to exist in quantities that defied rational explanation. At Camp McCain in Mississippi, a former tank commander found himself earning $5 per day working in a lumber mill, more money than he had made in an entire week as a soldier in the Wehrmacht. He told his fellow prisoners that they had been lied to about America, told that the nation was weak, decadent, controlled by Jews and bankers who had sapped its strength. But the evidence of their own eyes contradicted that propaganda completely. America built Liberty ships in 4 days. 4 days from laying the keel to launching a completed vessel. In Germany, the same process took 4 months. He wasn't exaggerating about the construction timeline. The SS Robert E. Peary had been launched just 4 days and 15 hours after work began on her keel. By 1945, American shipyards were building vessels faster than German U-boats could possibly sink them, producing 3 Liberty ships for everyone that was torpedoed and sent to the bottom. The prisoners processed these statistics while they processed tomatoes, picked peaches, cut timber. They earned their 80 cents per day, while America earned billions from their labor. In June of 1945, at Camp Papago Park in Arizona, the temperature climbed to 118 degrees. German prisoners worked the cotton fields in that brutal heat. Local farmers paid the government $1.50 per prisoner per day. The prisoners received 80 cents. The government kept the 70-cent difference as pure profit. When you multiply that profit margin across 400,000 prisoners working 365 days per year, the total becomes staggering. America made $102 million in pure profit from prisoner of war labor, equivalent to approximately $1.7 billion in contemporary currency. The enemy was paying for his own imprisonment while simultaneously saving the American economy, a perfect closed loop of capitalist efficiency. But what the prisoners observed in those cotton fields revealed something else about America, something more complicated and troubling. Black Americans and German prisoners worked side by side in the same fields, but the Germans were allowed to eat in restaurants that banned their black co-workers. They could use bathrooms that were forbidden to the Americans they worked alongside. An Unteroffizier named Paul Hoffman wrote in a letter that America's democracy clearly had significant flaws and failures, but even those failures somehow surpassed what Germany had achieved with its supposed master race ideology. The irony cut deep when you examined it closely. Nazi racial theories encountered American segregation, and the master race found itself picking cotton alongside the people America's system oppressed, and both groups discovered they were simply workers in America's vast economic machine, differentiated by the color of their skin, but ultimately serving the same function. In August of 1945, when the atomic bombs fell on Japan, the prisoners at Camp Carson in Colorado learned that America had successfully split the atom, had built entire secret cities to accomplish that goal, had spent $2 billion on a single weapons project. That's approximately $28 billion in current dollars, more than Germany's entire military budget for 1944. A former physicist named Werner Braun sat on his bunk doing calculations. The Manhattan Project had employed 130,000 people. It had constructed 3 secret cities that didn't appear on any maps. And Germany's intelligence services had known nothing about any of it. Braun found that fact almost more disturbing than the bombs themselves. America had kept a secret larger than Germany's entire rocket program completely hidden. The numbers involved in the Manhattan Project seemed designed to break the minds of people trying to comprehend them. Oak Ridge, Tennessee consumed more electricity than the entire city of Detroit. The Hanford site in Washington required 50,000 construction workers. Los Alamos, New Mexico, didn't officially exist. America had built the apocalypse while German prisoners of war picked peaches in Georgia orchards, and the two activities had proceeded simultaneously, one visible and one hidden, both contributing to the same ultimate outcome. September 1945 brought Japan's surrender and the official end of the war, but the work continued for the German prisoners. America now needed food for occupied Germany. The conquered nation had to be fed, and American agriculture would do the feeding, with German prisoners helping to grow the crops that would sustain their defeated homeland. The conquered sustained their conquerors, who in turn sustained the conquered. The economic circle was complete. December of 1945 marked the beginning of repatriation, but the process moved slowly, in part because American farmers protested loudly about losing their labor force. They needed those German workers. Congress responded by extending the program. Prisoners of war continued working throughout 1946, and some remained in American camps until the middle of 1947. During those additional years, they generated another $180 million in agricultural value for the American economy. Hans Fischer, the same soldier who had surrendered near Caen in Normandy back in June of 1944, finally boarded a ship in New York Harbor on May 12, 1946. He weighed 165 pounds, up from 134 pounds when he was captured. His wallet contained $87 in American currency, his savings from 2 years of labor as a prisoner. He stood on the deck looking back at Manhattan's skyline, where every window blazed with light even though the war was over and energy could theoretically be conserved. In Hamburg, his destination, people had access to 3 hours of electricity daily if they were fortunate. Fischer told his bunkmate during that voyage home that they had come to America as conquerors, or at least as soldiers of a conquering nation, and they were leaving as witnesses. Witnesses to what, exactly? Witnesses to an economy that could transform enemies into productive assets, prisoners into sources of profit, war into wealth. The final accounting of what German prisoner of war labor accomplished for America is genuinely staggering when all the numbers are compiled. The prisoners generated $635 million for the American economy, equivalent to approximately $10.5 billion in current currency. They saved 15% of American agricultural production from being lost to labor shortages. They fed 10 million Americans through their work. They built infrastructure worth $300 million. But the ledger shows much more than monetary value when you examine the longer-term consequences. Approximately 25,000 former prisoners of war returned to Germany as convinced believers in democracy, having seen democratic abundance firsthand, having tasted its excess, having witnessed its casual, almost careless power. These men became mayors in the new Germany. They became teachers, union leaders, business owners. They built the post-war German state using American methods because they had learned those methods from the inside. Kurt Schumacher, a man who had spent 10 years in Nazi concentration camps and emerged as a leader in post-war German politics, met with groups of former prisoners in 1947 and told them something remarkable. They had learned what Germans had forgotten during the Nazi years. They had learned that democracy creates wealth, while dictatorship can only distribute poverty. The final edition of the Camp Ruston, Louisiana newsletter included an editorial written by the prisoner who had served as editor throughout the camp's operation. His words captured something essential about the experience. They had arrived in America believing they were members of the master race, superior beings destined to rule. They discovered they were farmhands, and the farmhands in America drove better cars than German generals had owned. It was a profound economic lesson delivered through lived experience rather than propaganda. America hadn't simply won through superior production capacity. It had won by making its enemies part of that production apparatus, by showing them the machine from the inside, by feeding them surplus food while they helped create more surplus. The contrast with Soviet treatment of German prisoners tells you everything you need to know about two different approaches to handling defeated enemies. 3 million German prisoners of war entered Soviet custody during and after the war. Approximately 1 million of those men died in captivity. The survivors who eventually returned to Germany came back as skeletons, broken in body and spirit, bitter, radicalized, damaged in ways that would last for generations. The prisoners who returned from American camps told a completely different story. They came back healthy. Some were eager to emigrate to America permanently. 5,000 former prisoners formally requested permission to remain in the United States. Hundreds married American women they had met through camp fences during their imprisonment. They named their children after the camps where they had learned America's secret. The secret wasn't military technology, wasn't advanced weapons systems or superior tactics. The secret was economic, and it was brutally simple. America could afford to be generous because generosity generated profit. Feed your enemies and they work more efficiently. Pay them fairly and they produce more output. Treat them humanely and they become potential customers for your products. By April of 1948, in Frankfurt, Germany, a former prisoner of war named Hans Fischer opened a small import business. His first product line was American canned peaches, the same peaches he had picked in Georgia orchards during his captivity. His customers included other former prisoners who remembered the taste, who craved that particular sweetness, who associated America with abundance rather than conquest or oppression. By 1950, West Germany had become America's strongest ally in Europe, and the former prisoners of war led that relationship in crucial ways. They spoke English fluently from their years in camps. They understood American business methods. They trusted American intentions in ways that other Germans, who hadn't experienced American captivity, sometimes couldn't quite manage. They had seen the machine from the inside, had worked its levers, had been part of its operation. They knew it ran on prosperity rather than conquest. The economic multiplier effect from this prisoner of war program continued for decades after the last prisoner was repatriated. Former prisoners established trade relationships between Germany and America worth billions of dollars. They imported American goods to German consumers. They exported German precision manufacturing to American markets. They built the economic partnership that anchored NATO's political alliance. One academic study attempted to calculate the long-term economic value of prisoner of war labor combined with the subsequent trade relationships those prisoners established, and arrived at a figure of $50 billion. In contemporary currency, that's approximately $500 billion, $500 billion in economic value generated from the decision to feed enemy soldiers ice cream and pay them wages for picking cotton. But perhaps the most telling testimony about what this program accomplished comes from an unexpected source, from a speech delivered years later in Houston, Texas. Hans Fischer, now an American citizen, addressed a Rotary Club luncheon. He owned 3 grocery stores by this point, employed 47 people, paid taxes, contributed to his community. His son served in the United States Air Force. Fisher told the assembled businessmen that he had invaded America as a soldier, and America had conquered him with ice cream, with electric lights that burned all night long, with farmers who called him by his first name and treated him as a human being rather than as an enemy. The Wehrmacht hadn't been defeated militarily so much as the idea of the Wehrmacht had been defeated intellectually and psychologically. America had shown the prisoners a better way to be strong, a better way to organize a society, a better way to create prosperity. Fisher paused in his speech and looked directly at his audience, at these American businessmen who understood profit margins and return on investment. America had spent 60 cents per day to feed him during his captivity. He had generated $8 per day in crop value through his labor. Now, as a naturalized American citizen running successful businesses, he paid more in annual taxes than the Reich had spent on his entire military unit during the war. That, Fisher told them, was return on investment. The room erupted in applause, recognizing the pure American capitalist logic of the statement. The story of German prisoners of war in America during the Second World War isn't simply a story about military victory or successful prosecution of a global conflict. It's fundamentally a story about the economics of victory, about how a nation wealthy enough to waste electricity casually conquered nations that counted every light bulb carefully. It's about how a country that fed its enemies better than those enemies had fed themselves when they were free proved the ultimate poverty and failure of fascist ideology. 400,000 prisoners, $635 million generated, 15% of agricultural production saved. 500,000 Americans freed for military service or defense industry work. One economic miracle wrapped inside a military victory. The prisoners came as conquerors, or at least as soldiers of a conquering ideology, and they left as converts. But they weren't converted by propaganda or forced re-education or ideological pressure. They were converted by prosperity, by abundance, by the simple overwhelming fact of American wealth deployed casually and without apparent concern for conservation. They were converted not by democracy's ideals, which remained somewhat abstract, but by democracy's ice cream, which was concrete and delicious, by its parking lots full of workers' cars, by its electric lights that burned simply because they could, because the power was available and no one bothered to turn them off. In the final analysis, America's greatest weapon wasn't the B-29 Superfortress bomber or the atomic bomb, devastating as those were. The greatest weapon was the ability to transform enemies into employees, to make conquest economically profitable for both conqueror and conquered, to demonstrate to the world that democracy doesn't simply win wars through military force. It makes money from those wars in ways that benefit everyone involved except the ideologies that started the conflict. In the rubble of 1945, as Europe starved and Asia burned and empires collapsed, that lesson proved worth more than all the gold stored in Fort Knox. The German soldiers who surrendered expecting slavery discovered wages instead. Those who expected deliberate starvation found themselves confronting surplus that seemed almost obscene. Those who anticipated humiliation and degradation found basic human dignity and respect. And those who expected America to be weak, corrupted by democracy and capitalism and diversity, discovered a kind of strength their totalitarian ideology literally couldn't imagine or accommodate within its theoretical framework. It was the strength to feed your enemies until they stopped being enemies and became something closer to friends. The power to pay prisoners fair wages until they transformed into economic partners. The confidence to display your abundance openly to the very people who had come to destroy it, secure in the knowledge that abundance itself was the most powerful argument you could possibly make. That's the real story of German prisoners of war in America, stripped of romance and examined coldly. They weren't just prisoners of war in the traditional military sense. They were witnesses to wealth on a scale they hadn't imagined possible. They were students of surplus, learning lessons about economic systems that their education had never covered. They were converts to capitalism, won over not by ideological arguments but by the simple material reality of its productive capacity. They saved America $635 million through their labor. America saved them from fascism through its example. Both sides got the better end of that particular transaction, though Germany didn't realize it at the time. And somewhere in Texas today, somewhere in Mississippi, somewhere in Kansas, there are old farmers who still remember the German boys who picked their cotton in the summer heat, who brought in their wheat harvest when American workers weren't available, who saved their farms from failure during the crisis years of the war. They remember the enemies who became essential to survival, the prisoners who powered prosperity during America's greatest crisis. That's democracy's final victory when you examine it clearly. Not conquest for its own sake, not subjugation of defeated peoples, but conversion through demonstration. Show them the parking lots full of ordinary workers' cars, feed them ice cream and watch their ideology crumble. Pay them honest wages and let them draw their own conclusions. Let abundance accomplish what armies alone cannot achieve. Make them believe, not through force or propaganda, but through the overwhelming evidence of their own eyes and their own filled stomachs. That's the victory that lasts, that builds alliances instead of occupations, that transforms the next war's enemy into this generation's ally. That's what happened when America turned German prisoners into workers, fed them until they understood, and sent them home as witnesses to a better way of organizing human society.